titles for the same objective. This is a warm-up for my plenary lecture to the British Logic Colloquium on April 16th. I hope you'll all come for that for the full talk, because this is only a portion. It concerns computability and its initial development in the 1930s. And the two key figures were Alonzo Church in Princeton and Alan Turing in Cambridge. Church was a decade older. He got his degree in 1927 at Princeton. He was a professor there in 1929. He worked with his graduate students in 1931 to 34 on the first model for computable functions, which was the lambda calculus. So he developed first a correct model of computability. Then in 1935, he developed a second one. He took the model of Abraham-Gödel recursive functions, and his thesis, Church's thesis stated in 35-36, was that a function is effectively calculable, which was the code name in the 1930s for intuitively computable. So his first thesis, privately to Gödel in 1934, was effectively calculable if and only if lambda definable. And his second thesis, which is the main thesis, effectively calculable if and only if Abraham-Gödel recursive. Abraham-Gödel was defined in 1934, a year earlier. So, the question is, by mathematical convention, if mathematician A gets it right and gets it first, and mathematician B comes along and gives a more elegant proof, but later, the credit goes almost entirely to A, universally in number theory, in geometry, and elsewhere. B is said to finish second. B an also-ran. So the question is, was Turing an also-ran? Did he finish second? A young fellow sent me a book a month ago in which he said Turing finished second. And if so, if he finished second, what are we doing here? Why aren't we at Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Studies celebrating Church, who had a 100th birthday a decade ago? So the question is, why Turing and not Church? What did Turing do that was so remarkable that we're all honoring Turing rather than Church? If Church got it right twice and got it first. So I'll answer that question mathematically, and I'll also answer it from the point of view, a poetic point of view, of art history. The story, the story of algorithms begins 3,000 years ago, but the recent history begins with Georg Cantor in the late 1875 to 1895 with axiomatic set theory, which was beautiful but allowed inconsistencies, as pointed out by Russell and the Bradley-Forty paradox and so on. So in 1900, in his famous address to the International Congress, Hilbert had previously reduced the consistency of geometry to that of the real numbers, and he asked in 1900 for a proof of the consistency of the real numbers. Then he realized there was something even more basic, the consistency of arithmetic, so in 1904, he asked to prove the consistency of arithmetic. Arithmetic just means plus and times. His formalist program was to eliminate any contradictions by not allowing intuition in the proofs. Intuition could be used ahead of time to formulate things, but when you were giving a proof, it had to be axioms and rules of inferences and strings of symbols. That was his Hilbert formalist program. That prevailed for 30 years, from 1900 to 1930. The program of a decision problem, the Entscheidungsproblem, began as early as 1898 with some systems, but it developed throughout the period of 1900 to 1930. But in 1928, the book by Hilbert and Ackermann, famous book in Göttingen, clearly stated the Entscheidungsproblem, which we translate as the decision problem, which was to give a decision procedure, Entscheidungsverfahren, that allows one to decide of the validity of a logical symbol, logical sequence of symbols, whether it's valid or not. In other words, to decide the truth of statements in what we call first order logic or predicate logic, most of mathematics can be formulated there. In 1931, Gödel, in his famous incompleteness theorem, showed that there wasn't any finitary consistency proof. He showed that any theory T, which is a consistent extension of piano arithmetic, must be inconsistent. And in this proof, he introduced two important principles. One was the primitive recursive functions, which he used to code the formulas. And the second was the idea of Gödel numbering. So he gave so-called Gödel numbers or code numbers to all the symbols, to the sequences of symbols, to the proofs, et cetera, so that he could formulate a sentence which said, I am not a theorem. And therefore, the system had to be either incomplete or inconsistent. The Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which revolutionized the foundations of mathematics, had another important consequence. Since he had overcome one of the main Hilbert programs, it suggested that the other one, the Entscheidungsproblem, might be refutable also. Now, in 1930, Hilbert retired, and he had a special retirement conference in Königsberg, the city of his birth. And at that conference, he reasserted both of these programs, particularly that there were no undecidable statements. So he asserted, in his famous words, Wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen. We must know, we will know. There are no such things as undecidable propositions. But at a conference nearby, a bespectacled young man stood up and refuted the first, the finitary consistency one. That was Kurt Gödel. And that suggested that perhaps the second might be vulnerable as well. So work began almost immediately in 1931 to 36 on the Entscheidungsproblem. And there were two main groups working on this. The first group was at Princeton. That included Alonzo Church, who was already a professor there from 1929. He was joined in 1931 by two remarkable students, Stephen Cole-Kleene and also Barclay Rosser, who contributed greatly to this investigation. Meanwhile, his advisor, Church's advisor, Oswald Veblen, who had gotten a degree at the University of Chicago in 1903 with his thesis about axioms of geometry, came to Princeton about 3 years later, stayed at Princeton through his whole career. He was chairman of the department. And in 1932, he was one of the founders of the Institute for Advanced Study. IAS stands for Institute for Advanced Study. It was a place where scholars could come and get permanent employment and never teach any courses. So they immediately welcomed Albert Einstein, Kurt Gödel, mainly because of his theorem, and John von Neumann. When David Hilbert retired in 1930 and was essentially not heard of again, John von Neumann became the most prominent mathematician in the world. He had worked in many different areas, as you know, and one of them was in the foundations of mathematics, von Neumann ordinals, von Neumann-Bernet set theory, and lots of other things. He knew about the Entscheidungsproblem. He had thought about it. So this is the team in the contest at Princeton. Church, Kleene, Rosser, Gödel, von Neumann. And this is the team in Cambridge. A 23-year-old young man, Alan Turing. Turing was an undergraduate from 1931 to 34 when much of the work that I'll describe in a minute at Princeton was going on. And in 1935, he walked into the lecture of MHA Newman, Max Newman, who was a reader at Cambridge and a topologist, not a logician. He heard the lectures in 1935, the spring of 1935. He came back in April 1936 with a solution presented to the astonished Newman. But that's a little later. What Church worked on first were the lambda definable, lambda computable functions. That should be computable, definable. Church invented them, probably around 1931. However, in 1931, he only knew that one function was lambda definable, the successor function, lambda of x plus 1. Not too promising. But Klenny was very smart, and Klenny worked from 1931 to 1934 on the lambda definable functions. And so by 1934, he had shown that virtually all the functions that you would think of in ordinary number theory are lambda definable. Meanwhile, Church's original system was inconsistent, and the inconsistency was discovered by Klenny and Rosser in 1934, 1935, but they restricted it to the so-called untyped lambda calculus instead of the typed lambda calculus, and that fraction, as far as we know, is consistent. But I point out here that in Church versus Klenny, Church had enormous help from Klenny and Rosser. Klenny and Rosser found that his original system was inconsistent and made it right. Klenny proved that all the number theoretic functions that you could think of were lambda definable and gave Church evidence to make the following thesis. So 1934, Gödel by this time was sort of commuting between Vienna and Princeton. He hadn't permanently settled in Princeton yet, but he was there temporarily in the spring of 1934, and he was giving some lectures that I'll describe in a minute. So Church went to him privately and made the following thesis: effectively calculable if and only if lambda definable. And this was based on Church's intuition that the lambda definable functions were so rich that they could compute anything which could be computable. Gödel's reaction was thoroughly unsatisfactory. Needless to say, Church was stung, and he said, well, if you can think of something better, you tell me. Not in exactly those words, but that's what he said. However, Klenny and Church, and to some extent Rosser, but mainly Klenny and Church, had become very attached to this system from 1931 and 1934-5. They both felt that virtually anything could be done. Klenny himself tried to refute Church's thesis by diagonalizing and finding a function that was computable, but not in the lambda definable structure. And when he did so, he discovered one of the most beautiful theorems in all of computability theory, the Klenny recursion theorem, because when he tried to diagonalize, he was producing partial computable functions. And every partial computable function, in particular diagonal, was one of the rows. So he couldn't diagonalize that. When he realized that, he became a convert to Church's thesis, a very devout, enthusiastic convert. And so they were both very happy with the lambda definable functions, except for one thing: public relations. Church wanted to prove the problem of Hilbert was undecidable. What does it mean to be undecidable? It means that there's no algorithm for deciding it. But if you're going to assert that, you have to list all algorithms and prove that none of them can apply to the particular problem. So it matters very much not just that you've listed out computable functions, but that you've listed them all out so that every computable function is on the list. Well, this was a public relations disaster. Klenny himself wrote, I was unduly influenced by the rather chilly receptions from audiences around 33 to 35 to disquisitions on lambda definability. Nobody had any idea what was going on, and nobody was interested in listening. Now, this is ironic because in 1950, another student from Princeton, John McCarthy, went to Stanford and MIT, and he developed something called Lisp, which stands for Lisp Processing Language, and he used the lambda definable framework to do that. Machines can understand lambda definable functions. Human beings in general cannot, with the exception of a couple like Dana Scott, who use it in their theoretical aspects, but in general, it was very unsatisfactory. in 1935 for the purpose of Church's thesis. But unfortunately, Gödel was there at the time in 1934, and so he defined something called the Herbrand-Gödel recursive functions. Jacques Herbrand was a young French mathematician. He did a version of the Gödel completeness theorem. Gödel's thesis is 1929. And he sent correspondence to Gödel about this. He then was unfortunately killed in an accident, which was a great disaster for French mathematics, or mathematical logic anyway, because Jacques Herbrand was a close associate of the leading French mathematicians who later became the Bourbaki. Without Herbrand, mathematical logic died in France for 3 decades. But anyway, he fortunately wrote to Gödel just before, shortly before he died, a general scheme for dealing with equations. Gödel took that scheme and made it effective. There are 2 rules of inference. But the thing to understand about this is that it is a deductive system in the style of Hilbert's formulist program. You start with a finite system of equations, and there are 2 rules by which you can replace one equation by another. And if in the end you get an output, then that's the output of it. So this had some very good consequences. The first was that people had understood primitive recursive functions for a long time. In Dedekind, 1888, showed that plus and times were definable by recursion. So people understood very well the idea of primitive recursion. For example, define n factorial by 0 factorial is 1, and n plus 1 factorial is n plus 1 times n factorial. So you're doing a recursive call to a previously computed value. The people thought about extending that to n-fold recursions, etc., but the problem always was there can be no effective listing of all the computable total functions, because if there were, you could go down the diagonal. So you have to allow partial computable functions if you're going to list them all out. And if you don't list them all out, then you have no undecidable procedure. So one very good aspect of this was that it gave partial functions, and it included all the primitive recursive functions and lots more. What did Gödel think about it? Did Gödel think that he had discovered a gold mine? The definition of a computable function? He said primitive recursive functions have the important property that for any given set of values, the value of the function is computable by a finite procedure, i.e. calculable. That's good. The converse may be true if besides recursion, i.e. primitive recursion, recursions of other forms, like 2 variables simultaneously are admitted. Okay, but the final sentence is the most important here. This cannot be proved. We cannot prove that any collection of recursions yield all calculable functions, because the notion of a finite computation is not defined, but serves as a heuristic principle. So Gödel himself, the author of the Herbrand-Gödel recursive functions, does not believe, number one, he does not believe they've captured the notion of calculable function. Number 2, he doesn't believe one can capture the notion of calculable functions, because it is a heuristic principle. So the second paragraph is the crucial part. It cannot be proved. The characterization cannot be proved. It's a heuristic principle. And so it sounds as though he's waiting not only for a formal definition, and this is the crucial point in answering the first question, why Turing, not Church? It's not just a right definition, but it's a proof that definition includes all calculable functions. So now we're back in Cambridge with Team 2. Well, not exactly Team 2. There was only one member of the team, and he was just a kid, 23-year-old kid. At age 25, he attended, 22, he attended Max Newman's lectures, but then he designed his own automatic machine as a kind of typewriter. His biographer, Andrew Hodges, says that he was fascinated by the idea of a typewriter. His mother had a typewriter. In those days, not very many people had a typewriter. So he designed his machine and as sort of a mechanical version of a typewriter. And also, legend has it that he discovered this in a meadow just outside Cambridge here. He had been jogging because he was a runner, and he lay down in the meadow to rest. And while resting, the idea came to him of a computing device using an extended typewriter. So there's an apocryphal story about the founder of this institute, Isaac Newton, that he sat under an apple tree and an apple hit him on the head, and he discovered gravity. So today I'm inventing a new apocryphal story about Alan Turing. He was lying in a meadow after running, and a typewriter fell and hit him in the head. Now, it wasn't literally the typewriter that hit him, it was the idea of the typewriter that hit him in the head. So his idea was to have an infinite carriage over which the reading head moves back and forth to right, raise, and so forth, one square at a time, before moving on to the next square. This was published, well, he brought it to Max Newman in April 1936. They were very disappointed to discover the church had already published this. The proceedings of the London Methodist didn't want to publish it, but Newman persuaded them to do so on the grounds that it was different, and they did. Wittgenstein said regarding these machines, these Turing machines are humans who calculate. Turing demonstrated that any effectively calculable function is Turing computable. This was the main argument. In fact, I think it's a pity that this argument appears in no book on computability, or not even my own, or not yet anyway. It might be in the appendix later on. It's a masterful demonstration, says Robin Gandy. Turing's analysis does much more than to provide an argument for his thesis. It proves the theorem. His thesis, by the way, was, of course, every effectively calculable function is Turing computable. But Turing's analysis makes no reference to whatsoever calculating machines. They appear as a codification of his general analysis. I've thought actually that IBM should be giving Turing royalties, because 50 years ago when I learned to type, the carriage moved back and forth and the keys stayed still and hit it. But an IBM Electric in 1980 was different. The carriage was fixed, Platon, and a little ball moved back and forth over the carriage. And all Turing did was to take the ball and put a set in there of states. Anyway, one of the key points mathematically here is Turing did it, Church did not. Church didn't even convince the author of recursive functions, Gödel himself. And throughout, I won't put all these quotes on the board, but throughout his entire career, Gödel gave credit to Turing and Turing alone. And when Church's name came up, he said, quote, much less satisfactory for our purposes, unquote. So let's back to the original question. Church got it right, and he got it first. Why not? Why not Church? Why Turing? Well, okay, Barry Cooper asked me to write a paper for the impact volume, and I struggled with it in June. And I came upon exactly this question: how to explain this to a general audience? Why Turing, not Church? Church, after all, would have been given the credit by any standard measure. And then it hit me. The reply is, why Michelangelo, not Donatello? Who was Donatello? Donatello was a sculptor in Florence. In 1430, he created a bronze statue of David. I'll show it to you in a minute. Remarkable work, innovative. First freestanding statue since ancient times, first major work of Renaissance that even influenced Michelangelo later. Then 1501, 70 years later, Michelangelo did the statue of David, most famous in the world. The single most famous statue in the world. By the way, the other material on this that I won't display at the moment is all on my website, www.cschicago.Soare. All this and lots more is there. So let me explain the analogy. First of all, mathematicians do not choose their project because some administrator or dean tells them which problems to work on. The people in this room choose the problems to work on because of taste, because of relevance to important problems in their field, and because of beauty. So every mathematician has a sense of beauty, and he values that in his own work and the work of others. So now I'm going to appeal to that beauty. The Bible, 1 Samuel, tells the story of David and Goliath. David was a mere boy, facing a giant 9 feet tall. He had been sent there by his father to bring food to his 3 older brothers who were in the army, the Israelite army. But he became impatient when the giant kept coming. The valley was narrow, so the armies could not face each other, and it was agreed that there would be a champion from the Philistines and a champion from the Israelites. But nobody dared come forward from the Israelites, and the champion from the Philistines kept taunting. So David got mad at the taunting, and he came to King Saul and he said, "I will fight." Well, that didn't go over very well, but there was no one else involved, so Saul said yes. This was a major theme in Florence after 1400, because Florence was a very weak city-state, and it was besieged on other sides by other stronger city-states. So they erected these statues of David as a symbol of the defiance of Florence and the fact that if anybody began to attack Florence, they would suffer this fate. So Donatello gave this statue. This is the first freestanding statue since the ancient times. He's standing on the head of Goliath. He has a helmet. I don't know where he got the helmet, because the real David didn't have any helmet. He got the sword because he cut off Goliath's head and stood on Goliath's head. This was picked up by another famous sculptor in Florence, Verrocchio. Notice the similarity here of the two. This time he has some clothing or armor, and he also has the sword that he took from Goliath, and he's standing over the head. But the similarity is analogous to the fact that Hilbert, Kurt Gödel, and Alonzo Church, Kleine, all participated in the formalist tradition. They all gave deductive systems. You have laptops on your desk. How often do you use a deductive system to do an algorithm? How often does the programmer of your laptop use a deductive system to prove an algorithm? I'd like to compare these with this one. 1501 to 1504, Michelangelo. How does this differ from the preceding? It's also a figure of David. Well, there's no armor. There's no sword. There's no severed head of Goliath at his feet. Why not? Because this scene occurs before the battle with Goliath. And the point about this one is that he brings nothing to the battle except a slingshot barely visible and except his mind. So if you look at his face, which we'll do in more detail in a moment, his face is filled with tension. Here, there's triumph on the faces. After the battle, they won. Here, he hasn't yet gone into battle. So there's tension, maybe anxiety, as he contemplates the challenge ahead. Perhaps this is the vision, this is the face that Alan Turing had lying in the meadow when the typewriter hit him in the head. And when he tried to grapple with the ungrappable, the unthinkable, according to Gödel, of how do you represent all calculable functions in a formal mathematical system? And how do you prove that they are there? Now, there's some similarities here. between these because you can't just throw out an art analogy. It would be vacuous and unconvincing unless you can make a tight comparison. Here's the comparison, and you can judge. They're all very young, all three. David was a boy, not even at puberty. Michelangelo was 24 when he sculpted this David. Turing was 23 when he found the definition of Turing machine. Number one. Number two, each one did something far beyond the achievements of their peers. David, Michelangelo, and Turing. No one in the Israelite army conceived of going forth with a slingshot to face a 9-foot giant. And if he had conceived it, he certainly wouldn't have had the courage to do it. No one in 1501 in Florence could take a piece of damaged marble, already nearly ruined by another sculptor, and turn it into the single most impressive sculpture in the world. And no one in 1936 could accept Gödel's challenge and find a definition of computable functions, intuitively computable functions, that was convincing to Gödel and that's convincing today. Why convincing today? Pick up any book on computability or mathematical logic that discusses computability. No one ever gives the lambda calculus as a model to students. No one today ever gives Erban-Gödel recursive functions to students. They did once. I'll tell you that story in a moment. They all do Turing machines or some variation, like shift register machines and so on. The third point is that not only was this an achievement far above their peers, it was a lightning flash of the imagination, the creative imagination, far beyond what anyone else had thought of or could conceive of. In the case of David, in the case of Michelangelo, in the case of Turing. Michelangelo said, and I have the quote here, but I won't put it on, he said that he visualized the figure in the marble. He didn't think of himself as a sculptor. He saw the figure in the marble, and he delicately chipped away the piece of the marble to reveal the figure. So why Turing, not Church? Because Turing saw the figure of computability in the marble, the pure white Carrara marble. He saw the figure of computability more clearly than anyone else, more clearly than Church, more clearly than Kleene, and even more clearly than Gödel himself, as Gödel immediately admitted. That's why Turing, not Church. So, I hope I've whetted your appetite. I offer these points. First, on my webpage, there's a following article about Turing. Well, about it's a webpage thing, but it's about me and Turing and Michelangelo. And then there's an interview picked up by but this theme, by the way, proved far more popular than I had believed. And so I suddenly was being interviewed by the Association for Computing Machinery and invited to give lectures on this and that and so forth. So this one is probably the clearest rendition. It's on my my webpage, and it talks about Turing, and it talks about Michelangelo, and it talks about more details of why this is an appropriate theme. And let me close with this remark. So here's the part about Michelangelo. In every block of marble I see, a statue is plain as though it stood before me, shaped in perfect attitude and action. I have only to hew away the rough walls. That's a lovely apparition. Okay, now, Turing did that with computability. He saw it. He had a completely different vision from everyone else as you lay in that meadow, and he thought of the typewriter. Church thought in much more conventional terms. I think to Church's credit, he saw computability in the marble of lambda definability in 1934, and he saw it again in, even though Gödel did not recognize it, Church saw it in recursive functions in 1935, but he saw it in the marble, but he was not able to chip away the marble and bring it forth. Even Gödel did not believe him, and today no one else. They believe it's formally the same, but no one uses that as a model for computability. This article I just put forward, which is on my webpage, made its way around, and I got this message from a colleague at Cornell. Robert Constable was an undergraduate at Princeton. At the same time I was there, he was a graduate student at Wisconsin under Claney, and he was former chairman and dean of computer science at Cornell. So he said about the article that I just showed you, the ACM article, it's a wonderful presentation, the idea is stunning and right in the mark, but I never thought of it that way before. I'm sure I'll be talking about it this way at our regular computer science meeting. So the general question is how you represent a theme which is not strictly presentable in terms of equations. You cannot write any collection of equations which prove that Michelangelo is better than Donatello. And you can't write any set of equations that prove the achievement of Turing is better than that of Church. In fact, many people, like Claney, believed that the other was better. So, how do you do that? Well, I claim that mathematicians understand things more than by line equations. They understand by sense of beauty, and when you show them a dramatic improvement in what's gone before, they will appreciate that. Now, you may not have been convinced at the dire consequences of recursive functions. So let me just close with this comment. In 1963, I graduated from Princeton, and that's when I took the courses from Church. I came to Cornell. At Cornell, Gerald Sachs, now at Harvard, gave a course in computability. It began with the Ehrbrand-Gödel recursive functions as the definition of a computable function. It was sheer torture. And then it moved to the Claney T predicate and mu recursive functions. Okay? This is a 4-month course. It nearly nauseated me to the point that I dropped out of computability theory, not quite. And then it moved to the Friedberg finite injury solution of post problem in 1957, which was unreadable because it was written in the Claney equational and remains unreadable because it was written in the Claney equational calculus, as was the Claney post paper in 1954. And Sachs's own book in 1963 was totally, I defy anyone in this room to pick up Sachs's book on degrees, open to a theorem, and tell me what that theorem says and what the proof is. And the reason is, number one, the Claney T predicate itself had no intuition and no understanding of what was going on, and furthermore, by using it, people felt a license to provide no intuition as what was going on. So, for example, Church's, Sachs's 1964 density theorem, the beautiful theorem, but it has a mistake. And when his student Bob Robinson discovered the mistake, Sachs said, I'll give you a PhD if you promise not to tell anybody about the mistake. Because no one could understand whether a mistake was there or not. Then Lachlan came across with a brilliant idea. I used that to write a paper in 1975 on the infinite superiority method, and I went back to Sachs's book, and I took every one of the theorems from his book, and I applied these simple techniques, and they all came out ding, 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 with no problem at all, but because of the intuition as opposed to the formalism. So that's the second lecture that I won't give today, which is the malevolent effect of Kleinian normal form and formalism on recursion theory, and the positive effect of Turing, Post, Hartley-Rogers 67, and Lachlan on revealing intuition. So I'll let you ponder that while I close.
Any questions?
Thank you for your really beautiful talk. There's the Turing thesis, which is an equation. There's the Church's thesis, another equation. Isn't the distinction between them that the Turing thesis is intentional, whereas it's talking about equation between algorithms, whereas the Church thesis is extensional, an equation between sets of functions?
Well, each is a combination of intentional and extensional, because each says if you consider the intuitive class of functions, which we call effectively calculable, that corresponds with a particular formal class. Church's thesis 1 said it corresponds with the lambda definable functions. Church's thesis 2 said it corresponds with the Airborne-Gödel computable functions, and Turing's thesis said it corresponds with the Turing computable ones. So they are all extensionally equivalent, because in 1936-37 it was proved by Church and Kleine, lambda definable if and only if recursive, and then by Turing, lambda definable if and only Turing computable. But the point is that you and I are not extensional beings. It's fine that they are all extensionally equivalent, but the crucial point was not to make an assertion like that, but to prove that the intentional class of effectively calculable functions coincided with these. Okay.
So what Turing proved was the intentional equation.
Exactly. In fact, okay, so this is the part that I had done down earlier about Gandhi. I think Gandhi says a beautiful thing right here, because he says basically that, let's go back to this for a second. Gandhi, unfortunately Gandhi is now dead. Gandhi was a reader at Oxford and a professor at Manchester. But what he said is that this is a theorem as precise and formal and convincing as most theorems in mathematics. Namely, this is intentional equals extensional. The intentional idea of effectively calculable coincides with the extensional idea of a Turing machine. Because when he did this, he had no idea about the recursive functions or the lambda definable functions. That came later when he found out. So my own guess is that his theorem comes in two parts. One is the definition of a Turing machine, and two is the proof, the demonstration that everything which is effectively calculable is Turing computable. Now, I didn't give that proof. I'm going to give it for the British Mathematical Colloquium, but the proof goes like this. Suppose you and I are doing a computation, or Euclid, or Archimedes. Well, we can think of the computation as taking place in little discrete boxes, like squares. Now, we could have infinitely many symbols, but we could code those symbols by 2, say 1 and blank. And that could be taking place in several dimensions, like 3 dimensions. But again, we could code it to take place in 1 dimension. And as we're examining a square, we would probably like a bound on how far we would jump to the next square in one step, like k. But again, by carefully reprogramming the device, we could make it k equals 1, because we could take those k steps in successive steps. This was a brilliant step. This was equivalent to David's thinking of using a slingshot to kill the giant, and Michelangelo's using the Carrara marble. It was something that ordinary human beings never do, almost never do, and that the specialized geniuses do very seldom. It was a flash of creative insight. And I suspect that he did that first, before he defined the Turing machine. I suspect he sat in that field and said to himself, now what would it take for a human being to do a calculation? Well, he'd have to have, could do it in one dimension, could do it so many symbols and so forth. I think that's what took place, and then he put it, because by the time he gave this demonstration in section 9 of his paper, he had already laid out the machine, and he was just showing that it fit in. But that was the brilliant part. Now Church tried to do that. In his paper in 36, he talked about lambda calculus, and he talked about the recursive functions, but he never really succeeded in showing that anything computable by a human being, effectively calculable, was calculable by recursive functions. And in fact, if you think about it, so what Kleene did was to code the recursive functions, and so he had a sequence of recursive operations, and then you had the least number operator looking for the search. Why is any of those things computable? I mean, sorry, the other way around. Why, if you have an effectively calculable function, why is it, in the wildest dreams, why is it recursive? Well, the only reason it's recursive is because you take Archimedes' algorithm, or Euclid, and you can number the steps in the algorithm, give them all numbers, and then you go through step by step, hopefully primitive recursive move from one step to the next, then you have an unbounded search to look for the least number. You try to tell that to an Apple computer salesman. It doesn't go over. He's not going to believe that that looks anything like a computation. The Gödel number, and Kleene, who gets all the credit for this terrible monstrosity, the Kleene T-paradigm and so forth, just took two ideas of Gödel. His 1931 theorem with the Gödel numbering, and his 1934 idea of the airborne Gödel. He didn't put anything more into it than that, just those two things, and he put them together. And then, actually, I guess I'm particularly reacting now, hopefully referees in the audience. Barry Cooper asked me to write a paper for the Royal Society, which I did. I got back 2 reports. First referee was pretty mechanical. Second one said, oh no, much too much Turing, you should concentrate more on Kleene. Kleene did this, Kleene did that, Kleene did the normal form. So my blood boiled as I read his referee's report. I said, okay, I wasn't going to talk about this, but now that you brought it up, now it's fair game. I'm going to talk about it. I'll tell you exactly what Kleene did in 36 and why it's inferior. I'll tell you exactly what he did in 43 and why it's inferior. You opened the conversation just like a court of law where the judge says, well, you're not supposed to talk about that, but the other attorney does, brings it up, then you're allowed to talk about it. So I think the whole Kleene apparatus was an albatross on the neck of recursive function theory for 30 years until it was rescued by Rogers and especially Lachlan. By the other way, the other brilliant person, the first brilliant person in all this was Turing, and to some extent also Post in 1944, but the other really brilliant person was Alistair Lachlan, who also got his degree at Cambridge around 1962 or 3, and he, what he did was to take this moribund, on its death's doorstep theory of Sachs and the others that nobody could read. Nobody could even verify the proofs anymore, much less find new ones. By 1965, 67, he came along and he said, here are the tricks. This is what's going on. Lachlan games, Lachlan topology of priority arguments, Lachlan trees. And those have been our main apparatus since 1970. That's 40 years. He did that. So the sequence goes Turing, Post, Rogers' book, 67, and Lachlan, 1970-75.
I think maybe you should apply yourself to explaining how Hubble stole the limelight from Lemaitre. I know it's not your field, but maybe you could publicise it. I want to ask you, what do you think Wittgenstein meant by what you quoted there?
He was a close friend of Turing, and he talked about it, and I think he just meant what Gandhi had said, that these Turing machines mirror what human beings can calculate. So the Turing machines incorporated just what human beings can do. That's my
Although we
opinion.
don't do it anything like that whatsoever, do we? I mean,
Well-
makes sense, doesn't it,
Well, at least theoretically.
We should be clearing out of this room roundabout now, so maybe we should. Okay, thanks very much.
Sure, okay.